There are different ways to authenticate a subject, and the very basic thing in authentication, as I told you in my earlier video, is supplicant providing credentials. But depending on how the supplicant is providing these credentials, we can categorize different types of authentication, because the authentication process is really depending on the types of credentials provided by the supplicant. So the first one is what you know. So if whatever is provided by the supplicant is based on what the supplicant knows about himself or herself, that's what we call what you know. So a good example of this is a password or PIN number and so on. So this type of, I would say, authentication is probably the weakest type of authentication, because whatever you know could be stolen. The next type of authentication, before I move on to the next type of authentication, we call also this type of authentication as type 1 authentication, because it's probably the most basic type of authentication. The next type of authentication is based on what you have, or what a subject actually has. So in this case, the authentication is done based on what a subject carries around. And a good example of this is a token device you use, or a card or smart card you're carrying to have access to a building or a parking lot and so on. So whatever you're carrying could belong to this type of authentication if you're using it to get authenticated. So this type of authentication is a little stronger than, I guess, the type 1 authentication, but still not the strongest. So we call this type 2 authentication. And finally, authentication can be based on what a subject does, or what a subject is, or what you are. So both of these, we call them collectively biometrics. So for example, in case of what you are or what a subject is, what we refer to by this is something like fingerprint, or your retina scan, or your palm print and so on. So whatever is part of your body, this could be considered what you are. When it comes to what you do, a good example of this could be, for example, the way you walk or the way you speak and so on. So altogether, what you do, what you are, we call this type of authentication type 3 authentication. So when you're doing authentication, of course you can just do one type of authentication at a time, which is perfectly fine, but that doesn't necessarily mean that whatever authentication you're doing is the most secure type of authentication. So how would we do the authentication so that we make sure whatever we do is much more secure than just doing one type of authentication? That's what we're going to look into in the next slide. So a better way of doing authentication is using more than one type of authentication method. So for example, mixing type 1 and type 2, or mixing type 2 and type 3, or all three, type 1, type 2, type 3, using them step by step all at the same time, that will be probably the strongest type of authentication. So when we do these different types of authentication together, we call it multi-factor authentication, because instead of using one factor of authentication, which could be type 1, type 2, or type 3, you're using these different types of authentication all at the same time together. But even though you do multi-factor authentication, I think you're still vulnerable to threats such as Trojans or man-in-the-middle type of attacks. So the bottom line here is any type of authentication, including multi-factor authentication, is not 100% safe either.